perhaps not for I'm sure not for everyone, but for me, like I think sometimes going to see art in a gallery, it can almost have something like a little bit akin to like a religious experience. Like it's, it can feel quite reverent.
Welcome to the Flying Fruit Bowl, a platform dedicated to the discussion and exploration of art and the creative process. I'm your host, Aaron S., and today's episode is the second part of a two-part conversation with the amazing Constance Regardsoe. If you haven't heard the first part, please listen to last week's episode before continuing. Thank you very much. Water and its metaphorical meanings, such as the duality of rising and falling, play a large role in Constance's work. That's super interesting. And I think that actually, to me, that says a lot about kind of like the way in which we kind of see ourselves in terms of like, like maybe a lot more women may be more comfortable with their bodies because it's something that's kind of been imposed on them by society. I think it opens up a really interesting discourse for the wider kind of societal ways we look at men's bodies and women's bodies. And, like obviously like people in between, for instance, I think that's kind of opens up a really interesting discourse that now's not the time to have. I think that's something maybe that in the future your work might kind of pertain to, or it might kind of inspire somebody to think about, because kind of an interesting point, like, yeah. And I wonder, like, had things been different, I don't think people may not have been, maybe if the environment was different as well, people wouldn't have been as willing or as kind of just like in the mood. Whereas in it's like,
Yes.
That's like what the cool thing about that though is that you actually took the opportunity and you actually now have something from the opportunity, and you also have the memory. Like that's what's interesting. So your work has now become about memory as well. So that's very interesting.
My whole life is seized opportunities to take photos for art. It literally permeates into everything. I generally have my camera with me just in case I can kind of squeeze something in.
And that also is why you're going to be successful, because you already have the preparation there. Like you're very conscious that you're going to have fun, but it's also a bit of work as well. Like you're going to get something out of it that you're going to be able to use in the future. So it's like, you didn't go there and be like, oh, I wasted this opportunity. I could have took images. You were like, cool, I'm going to go into images. What's having fun? And I think that's the idea of being prepared. I think that's what I think a lot of artists may potentially lack, in terms of like, they're not always ready to observe around them, to take the opportunities or take like the scenes they look at to create work. So I think, that's, honestly, like fair play to you and like well done for like fostering that, because like that's off your own back, and it serves you well, because now you've got stuff to work with. You've got the exact thing you wanted as well. It's not just we have to make do with random reference images from Pinterest. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's like you've got stuff that feels like the original source material is original to you, therefore your work is now going to be original.
I some people probably feel differently, but I feel like if you're going to consider yourself an artist and you're going to paint from photographs, you have to take them yourself, or at least kind of set them up. I know some people disagree with this, but I think it's such a big part of the process. It would be like, to me, it would just feel wrong. It would feel like I'm skipping a really important step.
So I have a good artist friend called Rihanna Bathello, who I'm going to send you her work. And also I've got a question on this interview from her, because she's an incredibly awesome artist and she's super lovely. But one thing I said to her, I was like, the one way I feel like your work would improve is if you take your own photographs. Because she doesn't. And there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's all above board. You're sourcing materials from, open copyright places, stuff like that. That's nothing wrong with that. But in my opinion, particularly with her work and the way she does her work and the kind of atmosphere she creates, I feel like if you were to take a road trip in America and shoot your own original scenes, I think that would be absolutely perfect for you and your work. That's the way I feel like she could expand. I've had this conversation with her a few times, but that may not happen, may happen. We don't know. But for me, it's just like, I agree with you completely. I feel like if you want to create original work as a painter, you have to take original photographs. Your source material has to be original, because otherwise it won't be original. It's, and there's nothing wrong with sourcing image, like having like nothing wrong with sourcing paintings from images, nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But I don't know, for me, there's something about it that I'm a bit like, like, where's the imagination? Like art's all about imagination, kind of you can paint anything in the world you want. It doesn't have, surrealism doesn't have to be anything that exists. So why choose something that exists?
No, I think there's something, because your painting is going to be very dictated by your source photograph. It is,
Yeah,
to a varying extent, but it's a lot of what's in there is going to carry through to your final painting. And I feel like if you didn't create that yourself, I don't want to be really critical as well.
Oh yeah, of course.
But that's how I feel about it personally.
Next.
You're just missing out on a big part of that kind of creative process.
And also, I think the problem with that is that you won't really know what your work's about, because it's not about anything specific. It's just recreated. Therefore, when somebody says to you, "Oh, so what are the themes in your work?" You're a bit like, I'm not too sure, because they're not themes you've thought about and sat down with and kind of actually considered. You apply the themes after, which isn't a bad idea, but I don't know. You can tell very quickly if somebody knows what their work's about or not by asking them a few questions. So,
I also, this might actually nicely kind of segue into, I think, what's going to be the next few questions.
Yeah.
But we said we're going to move on to thinking about actual creation process.
Absolutely, so, that's perfect segue.
I find I don't think of myself a lot of the time as being particularly creative when I'm painting. I think of it as, I know that sounds strange, but I think I think I have quite a structured way of working, and a lot of it is quite it's not formulaic. It's definitely not formulaic, but it's quite like you're almost like a craft, I suppose, is how I would think of it. But I think the more, in a way, the more creative elements of it are actually when you're capturing those images and then just editing those images, thinking about how you're going to crop them, what you want the finished painting to convey, selecting which ones you want to work from, and all that part of it, to me, is where it's a bit more creative. And it's going to have such a big, getting those photos and then deciding how you use them is going to have a big dictation on what your finished painting looks like. So for me, I feel like that's probably the more creative. I know it sounds strange, but that's what I would consider the more creative element of my process.
Well, yeah, I guess you're right. It would be, because once you have the source material there, you're going to paint it. The actual painting part of it is what you're going to do anyway. It's actually getting the kind of imagery and the ideas before. This is the pre-production stage of your work. That is possibly the most. That's a very interesting way to think about it, actually. Because I'm very, very interested in pre-production of images, because I think with Instagram, we just see the final image. We'd never really actually ever see or think about, how does somebody get to that image? How does somebody get from the initial idea or sketch to this finalized painting, in terms of where was their mind at? Where are their thoughts at? What is their external influences kind of to create this kind of type of work? I don't know. I'm really interested in the minute. I'm very fascinated by how people get to creating work as opposed to what they've created. So actually, that leads nicely into the question, which would be do you have any particular routines that help you focus on your art?
Oh, I think a lot of it is just really nailing down that source material and kind of, I guess, making quite an emotional connection with it. So I have to feel interested and excited by the photos that I've taken, and then that is kind of, because painting is arduous. If you want to
Absolutely.
do it well, it requires a lot of mental concentration. Things go wrong and are frustrating. There's a lot of, I know this doesn't sound kind of sexy or romantic, but there's a lot of cleaning brushes, mixing colors, and the kind of the gritty side of it.
Yeah.
And they do take me a long time to make these, and I often find, and it often works like this. You start making something, and when you start making it, it has the potential to be perfect, whatever that means. And you maybe get your first few hours in, and you're like, oh, it's gonna go exactly as I want it to go on. It's gonna convey onto this canvas exactly as I want it to go. And then you'll realize you've made some kind of mistake or something goes wrong with it. And and it knocks you back, and you kind of have to like step away from it for a little bit and then get back into it, and then you kind of just knuckle down and get the rest of it done. And that, a lot of my paintings kind of follow that kind of journey. You end up feeling really happy with them when they're done, but there's always that kind of a point midway through where it feels like something's gone wrong. And it's, you know, it is a push to make the work. I mean, I speak to some people sometimes who are like, I just love painting, you know, I just want to be doing it all day. I like it, but I really like the output. I think there's other things, like, you know, there are times when I'm like, I don't want to look at this thing anymore. You know, it's like 70 hours in and I just want to go outside. You need to have something that's going to drive you through that to get it finished. And for me, it's that initial excitement about the source material.
Yeah, that's a really good point though, because we don't think about it like it's a dedication of time, such dedication of time. You know, it's just, and you have to motivate yourself through that whole period of time. And actually, that feeds nicely into the next question. Well, the next two kind of questions that are somewhat conjoined. So, like, I had two people I've spoken to previously, an artist called Alice King and an artist called Mark Thompson, who I mentioned earlier, both incredible artists. And they were talking about the idea of creating art in a studio. And it's like, do you create art in a studio? Like, do you have your own studio space?
So right now I don't. I have a small spare room in a flat in Reading, and I can create work in that space. I have some bugbears about it. And I probably can't go any bigger than I go right now in that space. And I would like, I have a space that I can work in occasionally where I'm actually a bit free to kind of stand up and move around a little bit more. And I do like the impact that has on my work, and potentially I actually think it correlates quite nicely with there being some kind of broader, more gestural mark making. But for right now, the space I have serves its purpose. Down the line, I would love to have a proper art studio, and you know, maybe there'd be other artists there and like feed off a bit of that collaborative energy. It's definitely something I aspire to, but it's not something that's perfectly viable right now. However, um, I am doing my first artist residency for the month of August.
Oh, wow.
So I got accepted onto the Pooch Cove residency, which is this artist residency in Canada. So I'll be there for a full month, and I'll have a very large, very well lit studio with a massive, very stable canvas. And there's also going to be 7 other really amazing artists there at the same time as me. So I'm really excited to just see what that does, because I think it will probably have some kind of impact on what I make.
That's so interesting. And that's so cool, because the next question, or the kind of thought that I was talking to both Alice and Mark about, is the idea of being lonely whilst creating work, because you're by yourself for a lot of hours painting away, trying to kind of put all your thoughts, emotions, and frustrations onto this canvas. And like, is that something you ever experienced?
Definitely, yes. Yeah, it's I find I have to, and sometimes you don't always want to, but I have to make myself go out and do things that to take me away from that, and I end up painting better as a result. So I try and go wild swimming once a week, and I think that actually really assists like my productivity. It's probably also great because I'm kind of literally putting myself in the environment that I'm then putting onto a canvas, and you're swimming in a cold river. So that's great. And but yeah, it is a challenge. I live alone for half of the year at a time as well. My partner's in a kind of long distance part-time role. So I have 2-month stretches where it is just me. And I think just for like my mental health, I do have to balance those kind of solitary periods with things that have more human interaction. And the teaching's very good for that as well.
Yeah, so that brings me along to that actually leads very nicely on to the next question, which I didn't actually write down. I've just thought about it. And this idea of, I spoke to a really great photographer friend called I'm Surrounded By. I feel like these interviews, literally at this point, are just me telling people who I've spoken to and who I haven't spoken to. But we talked about ages ago about introversion and extroversion and art, and how, a lot of people I speak to are introverts as artists. And, like, that may help or may hinder their work. Like, do you consider yourself an introvert, an extrovert, an ambivert, and how do you think it affects the way you create your work?
I think I'm somewhere in the halfway zone. Very strangely, we all had to take Myers-Briggs at my college when I
Oh
was
wow,
16.
that's cool.
I just got undetermined. They just couldn't quite figure it out.
That's great.
Yeah, I'm not sure quite what ended up settling on, but I feel like it varies. And I'm probably quite inconsistent with it. I think sometimes I just want to be alone and get on with things. And I think sometimes the idea of sort of going out and socializing with people is a little bit not intimidating, but feels like it's going to require a lot of effort. But then I actually generally do actually feel energized when I actually spend time with people. So yeah, that's probably where I fit on that.
That's cool, because I'm just kind of curious, like, if people are like shooting themselves in studios for stretches of time, but they're actually really extroverted people, like, does that affect their work? Does that actually affect kind of like because I think you kind of have to be extroverted to market your work, but you have to be introverted to create it. I think that's kind of the interesting kind of parallel between artists and everybody else. Like, that you have to have certain times where you're either one or the other, because you're going to be out with friends all the time, or you'll be by yourself all the time, and either of those aren't going to work very well.
Yeah, I had a joke with actually with a few people about this, but we sort of say that if I've been just in my studio for a few days, I'm just very socially awkward when I then have to like go and interact with people, and I have almost like a warm up period where I kind of ease back into it.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, it is something that I actually have to, not all the time, but sometimes I actually have to like prepare for that and like anticipate that that's how things are going to be. So I'm doing my first big art fair at the end of this month, which is in London, and it's 4 days, and I think they're anticipating about 8,000 attendees. So you're going to have lots of people wanting to talk to you.
Yes.
And I'm just gonna. I feel like I'm going to need to like take some time just to prepare for that, so I can be on good form for it. And you're right. That's probably another important thing about being artists. Balancing those two kind of conflicting needs, I suppose.
Yeah, I think also like talking about your work and practicing talking about your work and knowing what you actually want to say about your work, because I think it's very easy to be behind a screen and be a person online. But if you're art, particularly the art fair, it's a great experience from my opinion. I've been a few times now, and it's always been a great experience. And artists are so lovely, but it's kind of like, it's daunting if you don't talk to people about your work often, because people are going to be asking you and they're going to be judging your work and they're going to be right in front of you, and it's going to be like, you have to learn how to take that as an artist, because that's your reality with gallery shows. So
it's slightly one of the reasons why I was like, oh, this will be a very good opportunity. I just have to talk about the work for an extended period of time.
I think personally, people are going to absolutely love your work. I think they're going to be very impressed with it. I think I might actually attend it myself. I'd love to see your work in the flesh, actually. So I think I might attend. I don't know yet. I'm not too sure. But I think it'd be really cool to see your work in the flesh. So I think it'd be really good for you personally. I think it's only going to do good things for you at the end of the day. I know people will be impressed with your work like very easily. So it's going to be cool. So yes. So springboarding off the other art fair and the idea of like exhibiting your work, like, is there an optimal environment in which you'd like to exhibit your work?
So strangely, I mentioned that I started entering competitions and things during the year of lockdown. So all my first exhibitions were all entirely virtual.
Oh, wow.
And I don't think that's the optimum way to exhibit artworks at all, really. I know people are talking about doing new exciting things with it, but I do like art being seen in the flesh. So I'm probably in a sense like anything that's actually in person, just on the back of that actually feels excellent, and I'm probably quite grateful for anything that's actually physical. But in the future, perhaps I will become more particular. I mean, my very first showing something physically was in the Bristol, in Bristol at the RWA annual show in 2020. Yes. And you know, I had this big meter by meter painting that I actually did sell, but it is, you know, it's quite packed. They have quite a lot of work in that space. Which maybe can be almost a little bit intense, perhaps. But I do understand why there's so much work in there, because they, you know, they want to show a lot of people.
Yeah, that's a good point, because like the art, for instance, is going to be a lot of artists there. You don't realize how much art is there until you go there, and you're like, this is a lot. So that's kind of interesting, and I'm kind of curious. Like, are there any other kind of artists you'd like to exhibit with?
Oh my gosh, definitely. I mean, I show with a very small, like a small gallery in Chelsea, and they had one of my paintings on a wall, and next to it they had a Bill Bate painting, and they were someone that I'd studied in college, and it was like, that for me was just like, whoa, like this is really cool. So that was very satisfying for, you know, a very specific, possibly slightly egotistical reason. But I'd really like the chance to do like an artist run exhibition at some point in the future, and, you know, actually have some control over, you know, how you want to like lay things out, kind of mapping some kind of like viewer journey, I suppose. I haven't had much experience with curation, really. Yeah, like hardly any at all, really. But it's definitely something that I probably think about quite a lot, and I'm quite interested in. I went to the All Too Human exhibition at Tate Britain a few years ago, and I thought about curation a lot in that, and how it felt like, you know, they were really kind of taking viewers through something very specific and intentioned. And I do think like that's a fantastic way to engage with art. It's very aspirational for me right now, you know, having like a big, you know, big gallery space like that. But I can see why that's really, yeah, like really interesting. And perhaps not for, I'm sure not for everyone, but for me, like I think sometimes going to see art in a gallery, it can almost have something like a little bit akin to like a religious experience. Like it's, you know, it can feel quite reverent. You know, it's quiet, sometimes it's echoey, you leave feeling very inspired by what you've seen. And like that's definitely what I take away from some exhibitions that I've been to see. And I do, you know, I really enjoy all that kind of packaging of it. You know, but there are different ways. I mean, I went to a gallery in Spain, you know, and they were playing music. Some of the walls were bright red. That was very different. That was really interesting too. So yeah, I guess I'm quite open to different ways of presenting art. I think there's you can have quite different approaches that can be really equally impactful.
Yeah, because sometimes the way the work is presented is just as important as the work itself. Because, you know, as the artist, you have your own kind of idea and thoughts and opinions and how you would like people to see your work. And I think sometimes with the galleries, the white wall gallery space is kind of a bit bland. You know, it's kind of like we're kind of all a bit past that in terms of like there are interesting and exciting ways to present your work other than just one image on a wall. I mean, in my opinion, but then again, it also does work and it does serve its own purpose. So I guess we'll have to see what the future holds. I mean, I think artist run shows are a great idea. I think that's something that I think would be really interesting to run at some point. That'd be really interesting. That's like a future plans. That'd be cool. But I just had the idea of kind of like giving a bit more control to the artist in terms of like what they're doing. I think that's really important, because I think sometimes when you get into the gallery setting and the whole, you know, exhibiting work through a gallery, you know, you give a bit of yourself up for that. You know, that's a sacrifice you have to make.
Yes, so I'm, you know, for me it's very much serving the purpose, and it's a very like reasonable working relationship. But the gallery that I mentioned, and you know, probably a lot of galleries, is very much just set up to make the work as commercially attractive as possible. which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there are probably pros and cons to that setup.
I think, yeah, the commercialization of art, I think, is a very interesting topic, because I feel like in the last 5 years, with the digital revolution and the internet being the way it is, I feel like we've seen a huge shift. At least, wait, let me say, I personally seen a huge shift in the way that artists and art and artists are being defined, because I think so many artists nowadays have a YouTube channel, for instance. So many artists are doing everything other than actually creating art continuously. They seem to be, okay, so this is going to slide into social media, which is perfect. But like, I guess a question to ask you off this, to start us off, I guess, with that, to connect with the two sections, would be like, what is the difference between an artist and a content creator in today's society?
Gosh. Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like I should have prepared an answer for that one. Because you could argue that a lot of what is made by a content creator, I'm sure some people could argue to some extent, is art or has some kind of artistic merit. For me, I would go back to that idea about, I hate that I'm using this word, there must be a better way of explaining this, but that kind of obsession with subject that I think you need to have as artists. I think a lot of what gets created, as a product of like today's like internet culture, is quite a degree of depth, perhaps not always, probably not always across the board. And then interesting, you're getting art made about that very topic. The exhibition that I mentioned that I went to recently by someone called Mitch Griffith, his subject is all about that kind of like throwaway internet culture and our like voracious appetites as consumers of it. So yeah, I suppose that all kind of, it comes kind of closed loop in a way.
Yeah, the reason I ask that question, and actually I realized after I didn't actually put that on the notes, and I realized after that's a question I should have put on the notes, because that's a question that requires some thought before you answer. I didn't realize I didn't put on the notes, and I was like, oh wait, I didn't think I actually put these on the notes. But the reason I asked is because, as I said earlier, like I've seen like a shift in the way artists have been defined. And it feels like a lot of people I speak to feel the pressure to have to create content as opposed to create art. And a lot of artists I speak to who have asked that question too have said so the difference is, and I think it's a valid point. I think so. They say the difference between an artist and a content creator is that artists create content from the art, not art for content. So I think that's the kind of distinction that a lot of artists I know make, which is a very good distinction, I think. But I think also we live in a society now where there is not really the lines between the two quote unquote jobs are being very much blurred, and it's quite a problem, really. I think because the whole internet culture and social media society is really kind of ravaged the arts, I think, in a way. It's kind of tore things apart in terms of like the traditional sense of being an artist.
I mean, there is I definitely feel a pressure to create content for social media, because it's the majority of my sales have actually come through my Instagram channel, which is relatively modest. But I as good news as that is, it definitely means there's a big drive to create content that's going to perform well on that platform. And some of that is about art, but some of it's not always. It does take away, it takes away from you painting, and sometimes you're not really feeling like being like you're sharing quite personal things on a very public platform, and sometimes that does feel intrusive and you don't really feel like doing it. So there's an interesting kind of tension there, I suppose.
Yes, so that is actually a question later on we're going to ask you now, but it's an interesting conversation I actually had with a good artist friend of mine called Brian Dean Howes. I mention him in every single interview because I always ask this question in every single interview. And this idea of like, which is more important? Is the skill of the artist more important, or is the personality of the artist more important?
I think I would like for it to be more about skill than it is, but I think a lot of people really do think it's about the personality, and I think perhaps maybe even more so because my work is a little bit nebulous as to what it's actually about. People like to see some kind of that human element about it, and that's what allows them to make more of an emotional connection to it. So yeah, no, I think personality does play a really, really big role, I suppose.
Yeah, because I think everyone's interested in knowing who the artist behind the work is, because there's a very specific reason you create the work you create, and we all kind of want to know that. So I think, but then again, at the same time, as you said, like maybe you don't want to share that because you might not be comfortable sharing yourself on social media. It's a really interesting topic that I'm really interested in discussing with artists, just because I think it kind of serves us to remember that, just because we might feel awkward doing it, like posting ourselves on social media or like talking to the camera, for instance, just because we might feel really awkward doing that, like it will actually be beneficial. It could be very beneficial to you, because people get, it's like there's the way I kind of say is like, ask yourself what you like to see in other artists and then emulate that. If a lot of artists you follow like to sit down and have a story time about their latest painting, or talk about what inspires their latest painting, then do that, because if that's what you're interested in, people are going to be interested in the same way with you to learn about you in that way, in my opinion. That's what I can say about that. But okay, so continuing with the whole kind of social media online theme, like, do you think that your work translates well online?
I would say moderately so. A little part of me kind of flinches inwardly at the fact that these, meter by meter paintings that have hours and hours of meticulous, carefully crafted, minute detail are being compressed down into something that can fit on a phone screen.
Yeah.
But, people like seeing them on phone screens. So that they're not terrible on that medium. I think you definitely can appreciate them, at a small scale. I like it when it can be done in person as well. And we are quite lucky in a sense that it is, although it's becoming more video focused, I suppose, increasingly. But it was predominantly a visual medium, which does suit artists. I can see why so many artists move to that as a medium to sort of show their work, and it is quite helpful. Most people you meet will have an Instagram account, and it's a very easy way for them to like very quickly get a sense of what your work's about, just by looking it up on their phone. It's quite instantaneous in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. But then I think we've come to a point now where we forget that that's not the only social media site we have.
That's true.
I think a lot of people I've spoken to recently within the last week have like really kind of just really become very dissatisfied with the way that art career currently stands, because people aren't seeing their work and stuff. And like the only thing I say to them is that like Instagram is just one of many social media sites. It should only be kind of like one outlet for your main hub. Like your website should be your main hub. The website should be, as far as I'm concerned, in my opinion, like the website, which should be a website and your shop together, that should be the place you want everybody to go to. Everything else outside of that is just drawing them into that. So it's kind of like Instagram, yeah, of course it's cool. Unless you're selling your work off Instagram, people should be directed to your website. If you don't have a website, then you need to get a website. That kind of thing. I feel like everything in life, you have to strategize. And I think social media is one of those things where we've forgotten about that we have to do that. Like you have to know where you want people to go. And if Instagram is your only point, then I think you have to think about that in terms of like where you direct people to that is going to be more beneficial for you for actual sales. Because as I say to everybody, like if your follow count does not match your bank account, then I think, you're not exactly spending your time wisely if making money is your priority.
Yeah. So I know this probably isn't the experience that everyone's had, but I've been over the past year. I actually haven't had a website. I have got a brand new baby website that I still am doing some last minute tweaks to, but actually is live. And before that, for a while, I just had technically a website, but it was just an online portfolio. It had no sales facility built into it. But over the past year, I know it's not a ridiculous amount, but I sold 4 and a small, no, 4 and 2, 4 big, 2 small paintings just through people contacting me to make inquiries through Instagram, like not me like pushing sales, like people approaching me to ask to buy the work.
Wow.
Which was great and kind of surprising. But I did think about this, and I was like, I'm asking I'm asking a buyer to put a lot of faith in me for that. It's not a very reliable seeming sales platform.
Yeah.
And it's quite clunky. I mean, I actually had someone who just was making an inquiry, but they're like, I'm not sure if you do sell your work, and I'm sorry for approaching you if not. And I'm like, this is not good. I need to amend how that's coming across.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the good thing is for me, like the time I have been putting into Instagram has really led, like, it's definitely worth me putting time into it for the results that I've received. But yeah, no, the website is definitely something that I'm working on as well.
I just think it's really important nowadays to remember that Instagram is not going to be around forever, and I think we've kind of forgotten that. And I feel like, I actually asked a very good artist friend of mine called Laurie Bennett. She's one of the most coolest people I've ever met. I actually messaged her the other day and said, what are you going to do when Instagram drops off? Because people have built livelihoods off these platforms, but they're not going to stick around forever. So you have to think about how you're going to future-proof your career and future-proof your audience. There has to be other websites and other places that we can go where people are going to see every post you make. Where we're not going to be having to decipher between great art and cat videos. There has to be somewhere that we can kind of actually have a focus on art and kind of have things done the right way. Like, I don't know, there has to be. If not, I'm gonna have to create it. No, there has to be something. There has to be something out there, surely. But I don't know. It's just something. These are the things I think of. Not that it actually bothers me in any way, because I just do whatever I do. But it's kind of, these are things I think about in terms for artists. Like, why not mention that to somebody and be like, oh, by the way, are you thinking about that? Because it's an important consideration to have.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess it is like, I guess people do think Instagram is quite like all powerful for artists, but you're probably right. It probably does have quite a finite timeline. Yeah, I mean, I would like, I hope that this experience of having a physical show goes really well.
Yeah.
Or at least, well enough that I can do it again, because I think it would be I think just for like mapping out my calendar in future, it's something that I'd really like to have as like a regular fixture to my year and something to kind of plan for. So I would really like to keep a good degree of like that actual like in-person element as a way of, like promoting my work and like have that as a big strand. The website's getting developed. I do want to start doing a sort of probably once every other month newsletter, and I've been building up a bit of like a client and inquiries mailing list. But yes, no, Instagram has been probably has been disproportionate right now as for how people find me.
And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. Oh, and it seems actually like you're probably one of the very few artists where it's actually worked out very well for, which is good to hear, to be very honest.
I can see I mean, I don't think I would bother with it if it hadn't been. There's a lot about it that I really dislike. So if I wasn't getting the kind of results I've been getting, I don't think I would keep using it. But it has been helpful to me. And I mean, there are pros and cons to this, but I think there were good things about it seeming quite informal. One of a really interesting experience that I had as an artist, it was summer of last year. Someone commented on one of my pictures and wrote, you're something along the lines of, you're a really skilled painter. I really like your work, but I wish there were more people who looked like me in your output. And she was a woman of color, and at the time, my body of work was very Caucasian. And it was, again, I was using like minimal shoots. There really weren't many people in it. It was just one person was used repeatedly. But I thought it was a really valid point, and I thought it was a really good thing that this person felt comfortable enough to make that point of criticism to me. And I do think the fact that Instagram feels quite informal maybe facilitated that. So that was something that I do quite like about the platform. But I don't think you would email an artist off a website to write something.
That's true. That's a very good point. You're right, actually, the approach. And maybe that's the thing, though. Maybe people need to just remember that they actually can be a bit more informal on Instagram, as opposed to trying to be so formal and so kind of polite all the time. Because at the end of the day, like, actually, I said that's because, like, people treat it as like a proper business tool, and it's not necessarily. It's a social media site. Your website should be business. That doesn't mean that everything else needs to be also. So that's actually a really good point, actually. That's a very good point.
Just to finish with how that story turned out, we actually then got chatting, and I actually met her in London in the swimming pool at Hampstead Heath, and got a series of photographs with her that I've now painted about 3 of them, and I think I want to do either 1 or 2 more.
Oh, wow.
And then I'm gonna kind of share them with her, and then I'll be sort of sharing them online. But that's been a bit of a back burner, like,
that's so cool, though.
Project that I've just kind of had quietly going.
But like, how interesting is that? Because that means like your work has changed and evolved in ways you didn't even expect, through other people's opinions of your work, which is why it's so important to share your work. That's so interesting, though. And it's actually cool that you followed through with that as well. It's not just a case of being like, oh yeah, cool, thanks. You actually actively was like, okay, this is interesting. Actually, I kind of agree. Like, it's nice.
Yeah, no, I mean, I fully agreed with what you were saying. And it was something I'd been thinking about beforehand. And I was like, I should address this at some point. And then, I kind of wrote all that to her and, explained why it was so limited in its scope at the time. And then just I kind of tacked on, like, I wasn't really sure how I sort of meant for it to be taken. I think I wrote it in a way that it could come across as a joke if she wasn't sure. But I was like, if you ever feel like modelling, let me know. And then she was just very willing to do it. So yeah, that all turned out quite well. Yeah, it was also the first time painting someone that I didn't know. And I think I felt a lot more pressure doing that. And it's probably why it's taken me so long to make these paintings. I felt very nervous about doing it, but it was, again, I do think it's good to kind of push yourself out of your comfort zone as a painter. So yeah, that was at least one positive experience that came from that platform.
So would you ever do commissions then?
I've done 2 commissions in the past year. One of them was someone that I actually did know, not well, but like an old friend from university. And when I was like still building my skills as an artist, like a lot of artists do, I would take on a lot of like pet painting commissions, a couple of like family portraits. But it was very different to what I considered like my art, like my practice as an artist. The person who got in touch with me, I assumed that's what she wanted. She's like, no, I love your water work. Like, can I commission you for something like that? So I actually, she came to Reading. It was like summertime last year. We got some shots from the river, and I painted one of those up for her, and it's now in her living room. And that was a commission. Wow. But there was some kind of like personal connection with her, and I think it was. Yeah, I think it's very important. Like, that's probably a lot when I started thinking about how important it is to set your model at ease. I really, really thought about it because it was a client for a commission. But I think that actually allowed me to take better photographs for paintings in the future, like having that experience, where you're like someone, she wasn't an experience like wild swimmer. It was a very warm day, but like, she was like getting out in water. It's a public place, but it was very important to make someone feel comfortable in that slightly strange environment.
But like, it adds kind of just a new skill set, or kind of like a new awareness of how to actually create images in different environments. Because if you're going to like the same swimming pool that's quite a closed off environment, like every time, you're not going to understand how the environment itself would impact the work. So I think that's really cool, actually. That's really, really interesting. And that's cool, like you learned something from that experience as well.
Yeah. But just to answer your thing, my second commission was an even closer connection to that. It was like quite a good friend who is a recurrent model in a lot of my newer pieces. Oh, wow. Just said, she's like, look, I love them. I really, really like one. So yeah, I got one together for her. But I'm quite inexperienced doing commission work for complete strangers. It's something that's quite new to me that I would like to develop more in the future.
Yeah, I can imagine that being something that people would be interested in. Actually, to be honest, I think I could see that. I could very much see that. Yeah, because your work is very like unique and different and interesting, and it's not, as we've discussed previously, it's not about any certain type of people or certain kind of type of bodies. It can be anybody and everyone. I think it's very inclusive, and I think that actually says a lot for like people wanting to have that commissioned. You know, people will feel included looking at your work, and I think that's kind of a cool thing. So I definitely think commissions and stuff like that is definitely something that would probably happen more for you in the future, like for sure.
That's really what I'm actually so pleased you said that, because I think there's something quite like universal about being in water, and I do want it to feel like it has like an intentionally wide reach. I mean, she was like, no, I shouldn't make this person like, no. I worked with the gallery for a little while, and you know, she came round to my flat to sort of see some of the paintings, and you know, she had some very insightful comments to make. But one of the comments that she said was, she was like, "Oh, it's so great that you have a young and attractive bunch of friends who can pose for these." And I just inwardly, I was like, "Oh, this is a problem. Like, this is not the point."
Yeah.
And she actually hasn't sold any of my paintings as well, so I think maybe those two things track. But yeah, I don't want it to feel like it's. I'm really glad that was a point that you recognised about the work.
That's actually quite fascinating, because it's like it gives you also as an artist kind of more kind of thoughts in terms of like where you can progress your work, and okay, what else do you want to look at and who do you want to look at, and kind of, you know, I don't know, there's a nice idea of it being very kind of, your figures are very anonymous. And also water is like a really interesting liminal space. Like you can be in water and like, you know, be very removed from the world. So I think, you know, we all kind of like the idea of escapism, and there's a bit of an element of that in your work. So I think that's probably why it's so fascinating. Like to me, when I saw your work, I was like, yeah, it's like liminal space is kind of what I get from it personally. So it's kind of interesting.
That's a really nice takeaway. Yeah, I'm quite pleased with that as a viewer response.
Perfect. Right. So I have a question for you from the last artist I interviewed, which is a really, really cool artist called Danny Kidwell. I don't know if these episodes are going to go in this order, because there was somebody else I did interview before, like just before this. But I'm doing that second part of that some other time. So I don't know. I've got about 3 different interviews in different stages of completion. So let's just go roll with this. So the last person interviewed was an artist called Danny Kidwell, incredible illustrator. And his question for you is, do you think that there'll be a time where every image that can be made will be made?
No. I mean, just plausibly, that seems impossible. Like, life's creating new things all the time. Every potential piece of art mimics life in some way, I think. So, yeah, that just seems logically not right. As to the idea that like everything, as so much stuff is created, everything is like referencing back to something else, or you know, things become similar. I don't know if that's even necessarily a bad thing. You know, like art is informed by other pieces of art. So
Yeah.
I don't think that would be a problem.
I mean, I guess moving on from that question is like, is being original important to you?
I think you need elements of your work that are original. But I think, you know, I think humans are probably inherently interested in certain stories, and they're going to crop up all the time. And I think, you know, revisiting a theme that other people have examined, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing at all.
That's a very good response, actually, I think. And actually, do you have a question for the next artist I interview?
Okay, I definitely should have prepared this. Next artist that you interview. How important do you think limits or constraints are to your output, and are they a benefit or a hindrance?
That's a really interesting question.
In some different ways, but I think you'll get some interesting answers with that.
I feel like at one point I should just literally just take everybody's questions and had that as the interview notes. At some point, I think I would just benefit.
I had a quick question for you.
Yeah,
Actually,
of course.
we were talking about curation and the importance of doing things that deviate from just like the white wall gallery space.
Yes.
Have you come across any any exhibitions that you found particularly different or interesting?
See, no, I haven't. But I feel like if I was to ever create an exhibition, I'd want to do things differently, because I think, for instance, like I think black walls suit art much better than white walls, because in terms of color, like black will make the colors pop more. For instance, like I feel like white is, I don't know, there's something about white walls I'm not a big fan of necessarily. It's like online, I don't know. Like at the minute, no. The only person I can think of that comes to mind is there is an artist called Roberto Ferri, really, really great painter. Yeah, it's like I don't know. Have you ever seen any of his exhibitions?
No.
So
I've seen, he has one painting up in Meme in Barcelona that I've seen in person, but never just him.
Oh, because like there's, so I think one of his latest exhibitions is exhibiting his work in like a cathedral, and it's like obviously it suits his work perfectly, and it's just like I feel like the environment in which your work is seen is just as important as the work itself. Like there's a lot of really cool photographers that I've spoken to, and I've said it'd be great if it was like a completely black room with like a fog machine that reflects the kind of darkness of your work. Like what happens if the environment around you reflected the work? For instance, if you had work that was displayed, I'm trying to think, how would I do that? Like I'd have something where you have like, do you know like how when you're in the swimming baths or even just like in rivers, and when light hits the water, it makes these really cool reflections?
Oh, I do.
Like of course you would. You paint them, of course you would. I would love for like to exhibit your work in a space where that is projected onto the walls around your work, something like that. Because the one thing I'm thinking of at the minute is like, how can we turn art into an experience as opposed to just going to look at art? Because I think art is visceral. It should kind of have all the senses. And I think, I don't know, for me, like if I was to ever have an exhibition or like to create an exhibition, I'd be thinking about what else can we add to the art that makes it an experience, not just a viewing of art. I think that's really important. Because I said to some photographers ages ago, I said, what would happen if if we had a big mansion and everybody had a room and you recreated your photograph in the room? So rather than it be an image of the wall, it would actually literally be the set, as if it was a movie set for you to walk through. Like that would be so interesting. I don't know how the hell that would ever happen, but it would be so interesting. So for me, I think it's more about the experience of the art.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an appetite for things like that at the moment. I mean, look at all these, you're getting like the Van Gogh immersive experience. Like people are interested in that at the moment.
Yeah, because there's another artist, a street artist called Rowan, who I don't know if he hired it or like there is a mansion that he got permission to create work in, and he literally just create images on every single wall. So you walk through the whole mansion, it's literally a whole gallery show. But it's like this kind of abandoned mansion. I'll send it to you later. It's like an abandoned mansion, and you walk through it, and it's literally just like room to room is a different image. And it's like it's interesting to think about how the environment and the work can sit alongside each other. So I think I don't know, like showing art being an experience as opposed to just I go to a white wall space and look at art and walk past it. It's like how are you going to capture the viewer's attention and actually keep them immersed in the environment? Yes. That's my opinion of curating. That's what I think. Creation is something I would love to do in the future. Yeah. If it ever happens. If it doesn't, that's also cool. But like I'm very conscious that everything I do is digital, which is great. But digital is okay. It's not real life. I think we forget that. So I don't know. Something I'm very much interested in. I think I have a lot of ideas that I think would be really cool, but would be very expensive. So we have to see what happens.
I have this really wacky idea that I'd love to set all my art up in a room and then just have like a very, I was like, it would need to be practical, but have like a very, very shallow, just like splash pool for the floor. So
oh my goodness, that'd be absolutely incredible.
No one will ever let me do that. Ever,
that would be
I would love
incredible. That'd be such a good idea. Like I think that'd be such an incredible idea. Like that'd be so cool. Or just like how about if you went into like this environment and it was like outside? Actually, so the interesting thing is, there's like a minute, but I read this book once, and it's really, really something that's always stuck with me, which is weird. There's a book called Night Film, I believe it was called, and in it there's a chapter in it where the main protagonist, who's like a detective, goes to an old movie set to find somebody, and it describes him walking through all the sets that are abandoned, but like how he opens the door and it's one environment, and he closes it and he opens another door, it's a different environment. And I kind of thought, how cool would that be in real life? Like if you went into a building, but we walk into a building, but it's almost like it's an outdoor scene, but it's not inside a building. I think the idea of space, and the idea of kind of like that. I'm a huge, so in me, in my own kind of life and work, I'm always interested in the idea of freedom and constraint. And I feel like geographical freedom and geographical constraint, and kind of the idea of like buildings and like what we contain within a building. I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts and opinions about stuff like that, but there could be a lot of things, interesting things done with art, I think, in terms of experiences, as opposed to just images on a wall, in my opinion. That was a whole ramble. Right. So I only have about 6 more questions for you, so it shouldn't be too long. You can get out of this torture and get back on with your life, which would be perfect. So what does it mean to be successful? Wait, let me say that again. What does it mean to be a successful artist, and how do you measure the success of your own work?
It's so easy to get wrapped up in just attaching like financial value to it. And on a really present level, you do need to do that to some extent. I think probably almost, I hate using the word KPI, but like a thing that's important for me is just feeling like I could make a sustainable living from it. I don't think it needs to get beyond that in terms of finances, but like that is a, that like would be a reasonable achievement. So that I think that just practically is really, really important. I'm really pleased with kind of what we mentioned earlier, the fact that people with certain like certain topics have felt like they can actually approach me with actually quite critical things about the work. I want to continue to facilitate that kind of almost like dialogue element to it, and making it feel like it is approachable. That's something that I'm quite pleased with, and I don't really know how, but I want to continue to convey that. And I mean, if I feel like I'm making people have emotional connections to the work, that's really, really great for me. Down the line, and this is getting very kind of aspirational, but like I would love to do something where that has a benefit or some way of helping out younger emerging artists, because it is hard, like, and a lot of it has been quite hard for me. I'm not financially, but I have had like a good amount of I guess just like emotional support doing this. I'm in like a very like well-established relationship, so that's been helpful, and I've got like a good group of friends around who've been really supportive of it as well. But it's like if you're not getting that from anywhere, it must be incredibly daunting. Like I think people do need a degree of support, whatever your personality type is, doing something like that. So I'd love to help, like have some kind of part in that, maybe when I'm a bit more established. And I've always said, if I ever was able to make more than £40,000 selling art in 1 year, I'd love to set up a really small fund for emerging artists and use some of the money to do that. That would be great.
Yeah, I was just about to say to you, in what ways do you think you would like to help emerging artists? Because yes, you're at the minute you are an emerging artist, currently. So, well, I don't know. You're weird. You kind of sit on this weird cusp of like, because you're doing it full time. So, are you really emerging? But then also, you are quite new. So it's kind of like you're in this weird zone between being like a quote unquote established artist and being a beginner, or being like someone who's like trying to find like an amateur beginner, if you want to use those terms, like they're trying to find their footing. So I think you're in a really interesting position, actually. But I also think the more I think about artists, I think the traditional view of beginner professional doesn't really exist anymore. We don't really have that model anymore, because anyone could be anything at any time. So I don't know, but like, in what ways would you want to support? Is it financial support, or is it like, group shows, or kind of like, or are you not sure at this point?
I think more opportunities to show the work would be great. And so I'm really excited to do the other art fair. I'm really looking forward to it. But it's incredibly expensive to take part in that.
Yeah. And
then on top of that, they charge viewers to attend, and then they also take a commission on any sales. And I know it's expensive, renting a venue in central London. I'm not naive about that, but it is probably on the verge of starting to feel slightly exploitative. I know people want to be paid for their time, but I'm like, you must be raking in some profits there, like some serious.
Absolutely. Like,
and it would be, like I'm not against, like I want to treat it like a business. You need to invest in a business. I'm not against the concept of like paying, for exposure, but like, I think things being fairer for artists would be better. This isn't something that I've had personal experience with, but I was actually okay, two things. One thing that I've actually just started taking part in is it's run through Parker Harris Arts Organisation, but I got accepted onto this mentoring scheme that just runs like a series of sessions throughout the year about like the business and legal side of art that you might not have much access to. And I had my first session literally yesterday, and it was a lawyer who specialises in arts copyright coming in to talk about arts copyright and artist contracts specifically. And that was incredibly useful. So I think support things like that are great for artists. But one of the things that he actually got on to talking about was about when you apply for grant funding from, like Arts Council England or like big awarding bodies. Often what you're actually expected to do and like the hours that you are expected to put into getting that funding actually drop you below minimum wage. And there hasn't really been a consideration of that. So yeah, I don't think it has to be easy. I actually think the fact that it is so hard there's probably some good things about that. The fact that you need to really want to do it to be able to do it. But there are definitely things in the landscape that could be a little bit fairer, I think, personally.
Yeah, they're actually really good kind of ideas and options. Because I think the problem with wanting to be an artist is that like you can create as much as you want, but it's not just about creating work, it's about everything else that comes with that. Especially as we've said previously, on the business side, particularly at the legal side, which is not something I've actually really ever thought about, like the legalities of being an artist. Because just like you kind of think, well, everything I'm creating is mine, but it's like, but if you're putting it on social media, is it still really yours? For instance, like there's that whole kind of argument of like, well, who has the copyright to your work if you're putting it on Instagram? Like if you didn't read the terms and conditions, because who did? It's kind of like that's a really good thing to think about, and that's definitely the kind of information that we don't see that often and we don't share that often. And I feel like that's what I'm going to look up later, because I'm always interested in looking at like different resources I can find for artists that are going to help them. So that's a really interesting consideration. I'm just tying that down like legal, because that's an interesting consideration. But yeah, all right. Anyways, moving on from what I'm going to do with my time. So what makes a good piece of art? So this is a double barrel question. So what makes a good piece of art? And then I'll ask the second question in a second, actually.
Okay, what makes a good piece of art? Not everyone will agree with me, but I think a degree of technical competence like is really important. And I'm not saying I don't appreciate abstract art. Some abstract pieces I love, but like seeing a mastery of the materials, I do think I find that really important. But then on the, I guess, kind of separate, but also maybe married to that is like an emotional response from the viewer, which again is going to really vary depending on who's looking at it. But I think just if you're managing to make your viewer feel something, that's important.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's a great question to ask because, as somebody who creates art, it's like, how do you define a threshold for the thing you're creating and kind of like what you actually enjoy looking at? Because, as an artist, you look at the art, but you still have to decide whether it's good or not. So yeah, that's a cool answer. And the second part of that question is, what was the last image or piece of media that you saw that captivated you and why?
Oh, I think I'll talk about I've mentioned this a few times, so I'll blitz over this one, but the Mitch Griffiths exhibition I went to was incredible. There's just for that, how much gets put into them, and I also think the subjects that he deals with are really really interestingly dealt with. He's talking a lot about like some of his pieces are almost kind of satirical about internet culture. And it's quite easy to almost like there's like a critical element to it, but also, you know, his viewers are quite they seem quite like fragile, and like sometimes you almost feel like you almost want to like protect them in a weird way. So I found that really, really interesting. And I found myself this particular artist uses a range of different models and stylizes them in a certain way. So none of them are named, but they're almost established as like separate characters.
Okay.
And you almost start building stories around them. And I did it really unintentionally. I was like, why is this one being put like this? Like, what's happened between you? And so that I found really, really interesting. But I've mentioned him a few times now, so I'm going to go back to one before that. I went to the Paula Rego house in Portugal a little while ago. I had to be out there for something, and I was a little bit familiar with her work, but not very well, and I found it amazing. She has a series of etchings called the Pendle Witch series, and one of them I just thought was a really, really, really quite uplifting. It has this female kind of character centralized in it, and then this really big build up of like objects, and almost kind of like a narrative around it. And I don't know, for me, I found it incredibly hopeful and really lovely, and I really like that. But then because it's Paula Rego, the next room that you moved into from that was prints from another series of etchings, which was the female genital mutilation series. So that took a very dark turn after that, but it definitely got an emotional response, and just moving, it was very jarring. And I found the whole kind of change of that really interesting.
So actually, I guess a good question to ask you from that would be like, do you think there are any themes that art can't explore?
Oh, I'd like to think no. You know, I do like work that gets taken to some interesting and sometimes dark and strange places. And you know, sometimes I feel like my work should be more explicit about exploring a certain theme, but for me, this is just like what feels natural. But yeah, no, like I do like artists who explore quite unusual things. I think it's just tricky with artists having to balance, you know, running themselves like a business. I do think that creates constraints in what you can explore, because the market has demands for certain things and not other things. That's I think true. Perhaps when you get to like the level of, I guess, power that Paula Rego achieved during her career, you're quite free to look at what you would like to.
That's very true. That's very true. And it kind of leads into the idea of like, do you think artistic freedom exists?
So I've mentioned this before, but I do think that I'm incredibly lucky that the thing I want to paint has a good degree of commercial viability, because it would be horrendous if it didn't. And you know, you would have to make some kind of compromises somewhere else. So yeah, I think it is quite like a limited freedom. And I mean, it was a conversation I had with someone else a while ago, but like I find it interesting that there's this interpretation that like the artist is kind of like a critic of society, or like removed from things. But like when you actually look back historically, that's not been true at all. Like the artist was very much embedded in society, like reflecting things that the society at the time to an extent wanted to see. You know, I mean, a lot of like, you know, historically, like artists were generally, their big patrons were probably like royal families of countries. Like you can't be more embedded in society than that.
That's true. That's a really good consideration, because there is definitely a bit of a like, you know, artists are like the lone wolves that are kind of, you know, sitting there ruminating about kind of like all the the tragedies that have befallen them, and expressing that in their work. When, yeah, you're right. Like, people can just be creating stuff because art is reactionary. You create it because you think and feel certain things, and that doesn't have to always be necessarily dark. But actually, having said that, like, do you think there is a link between anguish and creating art?
Often, the artists that I really like, there's some kind of deep-seated emotional pain that's going into it, and it, the work doesn't have to look like that, but just it's something that I've noticed when I've started actually delving into like artist biographies. And I mean, I had this something that I've mentioned very briefly with you early on in this interview, but that does feed into my work a lot, actually. And I mean, one of the things that I'm really interested in with like putting bodies in water is about kind of like control and autonomy, and the fact that, like, when someone goes underneath the water, they're kind of setting this limit, they're deciding how long they want to hold that lungful of air for. And it's putting yourself in a like vulnerable, uncomfortable position, but you also have ultimate control over it. And that, I think, really feeds back to my personal experience. So that's definitely shaped the art that I make. And I mean, I had this, again, this was an Instagram thing, so I do have to give it a tiny bit of credit. But I had this I found this artist. I feel like I shouldn't mention who this is, but I'm obsessed with her work. It's incredible. And I just contacted her to tell her how much I loved it. And she got back to me and she said, she's like, "Oh, I'm so pleased you think that way. I really like your work too. I think we have quite similar thematic interests." And I don't know. She looks a lot about like the role of women and like women in kind of spaces and things like that. And I just kind of said, I was like, what inspired you to make this kind of work? And she told me that she experienced a really violent rape in her 20s, and that she actually intended the work to be like completely against that, but it's actually fed into it in a weird way, and it's stayed with her throughout her entire professional career. And then she was like, I feel like it was very strange, but she's like, I feel like maybe you're exploring something similar. And I was like, whoa, this is interesting. But yeah, I mean,
yeah, like, it's interesting how people can read very deeply into your work. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Like, that's really fascinating, though, because obviously it's not something you necessarily talk a lot about. Obviously rightly so, but I think that's fascinating, though. But it's also it just shows you the power of art and the power of connection.
Yeah, I mean, again, you're right, it's not something that's discussed at all, and I don't think it needs to be all the time, but that's very strange kind of recognition of that was really, like, interesting.
So the last two questions. So firstly, what would your younger self think about your work?
I think they'd be very happy with it, I think, actually, which is nice. I think the fact that this water interest has been sustained is interesting, and they'd like the new kind of places it's been taken to, and the development of the technical skill of painting water, because it has taken some doing. I actually had a really odd experience. I saw someone that I knew in college that I hadn't seen for years randomly at Paddington Station, and were kind of chatting, and they were like, "This is amazing. This is exactly what you wanted." And I was like, "Oh, hadn't thought of that for some time." So yeah, that was kind of nice.
That's cool. That's super interesting. Particularly people you don't really know that well have kind of thought that out for you. That's really interesting, actually.
Yeah,
it's weird how other people can see what we want without us seeing what we want.
Yeah, but it was good. I hadn't actually connected it back to what I would have thought about all this a few years ago, and it was kind of nice to do so.
That's really cool. That's amazing. It's come full circle, which is nice. So the last question is going to be, what are you currently working on, and where can people find more about you and your work?
Okay. I'm concluding a series of works from a photo series that I took in Croatia. I have probably the last few paintings to do from that. I'm also working on a small series that we spoke about of the person who contacted me about racial limitations from my work. So that's going to be another small series that's going to be concluded probably by autumn time. The new thing that's going to happen is probably what's going to happen when I get out to Canada, because I'm going to be in the space I'm going to be working in is right on a headland, right next to these very big kind of ocean waves coming in. So it's going to be a very different water-based environment that I'm really excited to get some shots in. So I'll have to see what that makes happen. And to find out more about my work, Instagram, sorry, but I also have a brand website, which is constanceregardsoe.com.
That is absolutely perfect. Constance, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. That concludes the second and final part of my conversation with Constance Regardsoe. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions or comments about it, please send me an email at theflyingfruitbowl@gmail.com, or please get in touch via social media sites such as Instagram and Twitter. The Flying Fruit Bowl podcast can now be found on a variety of sites, such as Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. If you like the show, please consider rating, reviewing, sharing, or subscribing on any of these platforms to help spread the word. Also, please check out theflyingfruitbowl.co.uk for daily art inspiration and written interviews. And if you're a creative, please get in touch for a chance to be featured or interviewed. If you'd like to support the platform further, we now also have a Patreon page where tiers start from £1. For £1 a month, you can get rewards such as early access to interviews, behind the scenes footage, weekly curated YouTube videos, and the chance to ask interview questions on our next podcast. If monthly donations are not your thing, we also have a PayPal. The link to that should be in the show notes. Once again, thank you very much for listening to this episode of The Flying Fruit Bowl today. And until next time, folks, please stay safe.